All right. And just like a disclaimer, this might be a little bit more advanced than what you need to know right now, like in middle school, but it'll be a good introduction to what you'll need to know once you're actually doing high school debate. So if you're confused with any of this, don't worry, it's completely normal. All right, we can get started. And if you guys have any questions, just unmute yourself, put it in the chat, or wait till the end. Okay. Some key concepts to know before we get on the framing seminar is that you need to know the difference between offense and defense in debate. So what we mean by offense is a reason that the judge should vote for you. For example, if you like the contentions in your GMO case, all of that should be offense, giving the judge a reason why they should vote for you. And defense is basically a reason why you should not vote for your opponents. And we're going to talk more about defense in our next lab, but it's basically like when you come up in rebuttal and you're rebutting against your opponent's case and you're basically saying that their argument doesn't really happen or something, that is a reason why to not vote for your opponent. But to win a round, you need offense.
Okay, so framework doesn't count as offense, so it's not inherently a reason the judge should vote for you. What it is more is just like you're telling the judge how they should view the round and how to decide what arguments are the most important. So basically it's really similar to weighing, but you'll just have cards for the most part saying like why this certain viewpoint is the most important and why it matters the most. So that means just because you have a framework and your opponents don't, doesn't mean you win the round. You still have to like debate on that framework. And there's also like an assumed framework in every round because you have like impacts and you have weighing. Framework is just sort of like above that. But the only like if you win on framework, it's because your opponents one don't access your framework, so their impacts don't fall under like the viewpoint of what's most important in the round, which means they don't like meet your framework. So then whoever links into the framework the best would win. So it's whoever has the strongest argument under the lens that you give the judge.
Okay, so the most common type of framework you're run into debate, and when we say framework, it's basically like when you read your case, you'll be like, we affirm resolved, blah, 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 blah. And then you can be like, our framework is cost benefit analysis. And then you would go into your contention one. That's basically what a framework is. And a framework is basically just how you overall want to judge the round. It tells the judge what to prioritize in the round. So the most popular type of framework is cost benefit analysis and utilitarianism. So cost benefit analysis is like when you're saying like weigh this on a cost benefit analysis, it basically means you should weigh this based, you should vote on this round based off of which team has the most benefits and who outweigh the harms. So it's abbreviated as CBA. And whereas util is another type of framework. So then like when you're reading your case, you'd be like, we affirm resolve, blah, 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 blah. Then you'd be like, view this round based off of a utilitarianism framework. And that util basically means you should vote on the side who proved that they have the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people. So that's when you look at if you have a really big impact that affects a bunch of like millions and billions of people, then you might do better under a util framework because you're saying, judge, vote for the team that impacts out to the greatest number of people. Whereas cost benefit analysis is just vote for the team who has the greatest number of benefits versus harms. And basically, this is the default framework. So if you don't say a framework in your case, which a lot of people don't say, then the default framework is cost benefit analysis. And most teams don't actually include a framework in their case. So just know that the default one is cost benefit analysis and sometimes utilitarianism.
So basically the goal of framework is to challenge our assumptions based on specific impacts in a round. So that's like we assume that cost benefit analysis or util will be the framework in a certain round. And so we don't say it, right? So if a team is like giving a framework for the round is usually going to be because they're trying to challenge the assumption of util and cost benefit analysis and get the judge to prioritize something that might not be like the strongest impact under that framework. So basically the goal of that is like certain impacts might get brushed off because like you can't quantify it, or it's not as probable, or it doesn't affect a large amount of people. So it may not like be the best under util or cost benefit analysis. So you'd have a separate framework to address it and make sure those impacts come first instead of getting like ignored. So like an example is a framework would give you a specific reason to prioritize an impact that affects a smaller group of people, even though like that impact and prioritizing that would go against utilitarianism. So you'd have a separate framework for how the judge should view it, so that that would be the most important impact in the round.
Okay, so what are some not examples of framework? Basically, if they do not meet the criteria of being impacts that are easily ignored, it's not a framework. So a common example is if you're like, in your case, you're like, we should prioritize this round based off of lives. That's not a framework because people already are going to vote for the team. Like the default one is people are going to vote for the team that impacts out to the greatest amount of lives. So we always care about lives, and we know that losing a life is a bad impact and it should be stopped. So you don't have like a unique framework or unique impact that constantly gets ignored. So basically, like framework is really just to frame the round that helps your case. So if you have like a small impact, you might want to choose a framework that prioritizes the severity of the impact versus how many people are affected. So basically, that's not a framework. However, weighing, which is something we're going to go over in later labs, but you saw them weigh in the demo debate, and weighing is really like a key reason of saying why saving lives is more important than like saving money or something. And weighing is basically comparative in the sense that it tells the judge why they should prefer your impact over your opponent's impact. And a reason why you could be like saving lives is more important than saving money is because on irreversibility, because you can always re-earn money, but you can't like respawn a life. Like it's not Minecraft. But another thing is constitutionality is not a framework. And a lot of the times in debate, especially in Alabama, people would always be like, oh, you should vote for this because it's like, or it's against the Constitution, and we should prioritize actually falling within the laws of the Constitution, especially with like the background check for guns topic. People always would argue that we should prioritize what is in the Constitution, which is not good at all. It doesn't really make room for debate. And usually debate topics don't even violate the Constitution in the first place. So you should never have any argument that's like, oh, this goes against the Constitution. Like that's not a strong argument.
So here are some examples of things that are a framework. So probably the most common one that exists in PF is structural violence, which refers to the systematic ways that social structures could hurt individuals, even if it's a smaller group of people. So to meet the criteria for this framework, it's an impact that is subtle, invisible, or is not the result of specific people. It can sometimes be pretty hard to quantify. You can't really say like oppression increases by like 70% when you vote F. So you have to have a separate framework for like the increase in oppression, right? So some framework cards will have things like it's brushed off and it's seen as like the way things have always been, or it's just like assumed and people just like don't think about it that much. So like specific structural violence impacts could be like racism or homophobia, transphobia, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, sexism, poverty, all of those that are just like generally negative things that are harder to quantify could fall under structural violence. So the argument for structural violence, you could say it's important to prioritize like marginalized individuals a lot instead of helping a lot of wealthy white people a little. Like that sort of, there's a lot of variation to it, but basically that like their marginalized people need to be prioritized because the severity of their impacts is a lot worse, even if they're like a smaller group of individuals. And you can give specific issues that would exacerbate or like reveal systematic discrimination, like the slow responses to HIV within predominantly Black communities, or like policing policies or gentrification. Any impacts that like affect a specific group of people that is marginalized would fall under a structural violence impact and under the framework.
And an example on the GMO topic is you could talk about like, you could say like small farmers are, you could argue that they're a marginal group and we should prioritize this small group before any of the big GMO farmers, because these are the groups that like is constantly overlooked by policy and everything. Or you could argue that like GMOs lead to certain health risks, and these health risks specifically impact marginalized groups and poverty the most because they don't have the resources to actually solve and treat these health risks. So in that sense, that would be structural violence because you're not necessarily impacting out to the greatest number of people. You're impacting out to the most vulnerable people and the people who are often most overlooked by society, which is why we mentioned in an earlier lab today that you shouldn't just vote for the team that has the biggest impact. You should see how they argue it and which impact is genuinely the most important, which is why framework is really important to determining which impact is the most important, because oftentimes it's not always the biggest impact. And another framework is existential risk / magnitude based. And you're really not going to run into this one a lot in public forum. But in the case that you do in high school, basically what it is an existential risk is an action that's consequences could like threaten the existence of humanity. So in the demo debate, like Caroline and Zach ran a nuclear war scenario, and that would be an example of an existential risk. And they were saying in their speeches that you should prioritize this existential risk because on scope, because it affects the entire universe. But it doesn't really have to be existential. It can just have like a very large and severe impact, like climate change, pandemics, all of that. So how does this meet the criterion for a framework? Because usually we brush these impacts off as not probable. So a lot of judges, especially in the Alabama circuit, will not vote on a nuclear war scenario because like it's really improbable for like a raise in taxes to like lead to nuclear war. So they brush it off as it not being probable. So they think that there's not a reason to vote for it. But we would say that like under an existential risk / magnitude based framework, what you're arguing is that even like even the small reduction in the probability of these events from happening is still better because it would benefit the world in the sense that like the probability isn't as important as the magnitude. So we want to minimize the probability of this happening in the first place. So basically you're arguing that magnitude and like the existential risk scenario is more important than the probability of it happening. So if you're running like a big impact scenario, you might want to use like an existential risk / magnitude based framework.
Okay, so if you run into a situation where your opponents are running a framework and you don't know how to respond to it, there's a couple different ways you could do it. Probably the easiest one is just to link into the framework so you don't have to dispute whether or not the framework is right or wrong because you already fall under it, right? So you can just weigh normally from there. So like a common impact of poverty would be a form of structural violence. So you could fall under that framework. Or like certain policy actions can anger the international community, which could link into nuclear war. Or you could find things that are like bad for the environment and then link into climate change. So you can sort of just like adjust your impact to fall under the framework, and then you can just like weigh it normally because you already like you abide by the framework. Another thing you can do is just attack the warrants behind the argument. Like so basically that would just be responding to the framework itself. So like the existential risk car analogy would be something like there's never going to be with like the probability of like a car running off the road, right? Like a car wreck happening is a lot more probable than like a bomb dropping from the sky and landing on a car, right? So even though that would be significantly worse, you still have to prioritize the most probable impact, because if you're worried about like the more unlikely one, you're never going to address like the real issues that could have like a very real tangible impact. And so that would be like a reason to not prioritize existential risk impacts and instead prioritize like very high probability impacts. So there's also ways to just like answer it in general without falling under the framework.
And for this, an example on the GMO one is if you guys run like something about GMO leading to small farmers falling into poverty, you could, the other team who's like saying that GMOs are bad could be like, no, actually, GMOs are or sorry, if someone the other team is saying like GMOs are good, you could be like GMOs actually help small farmers, and that links directly into their framework because now you're accessing their impact of poverty. So it just depends on what you went on. And if you also run climate change into like GMO, it contributes to environmental harm, contributing to like environmental destruction or something like that. You could also try to find a way. That's why you like in rebuttal, you find ways to access their impacts. So yeah, like later in debates, you're going to get into a lot of probability versus magnitude arguments. So make sure you have those prepared of what you want to prefer based off of your case. Okay, so the other thing you have to keep in mind when we're running framework is judge adaptation. Basically, you need to be careful when you're reading framework in front of lay judges. And when we say lay judges, we mean like inexperienced judges, parent judges, people just who don't have previous high school debate experience. Because to a parent judge, if you run like this existential risk magnitude-based argument, there's a very high probability that they're not going to vote for you because they think it's never going to happen. And no matter what you try to do to convince them to prioritize magnitude based off over probability, chances are that parent judges have made up some sort of like biased mind towards these arguments before the round even begins. So sometimes it's safer when you have like parent judges to just read cost benefit analysis, just because cost benefit analysis is like whoever has the most benefits, and that's like the most easy concept to understand. And another thing is when you go to tournaments, you need to read the judges' paradigms on Tab Room. We'll explain what Tab Room is, but that's basically the central website where you sign up for tournaments and you get like who you're competing against. So it also has like the judges' preferences listed online if they posted it online. So if they are experienced and say they're okay with framework, then you can run framework. And a lot of the times frameworks can be turned into weighing mechanisms. So you could like do that if your judge thinks that like PF shouldn't have framework. And an example of that is if you have like a magnitude based framework, you could just turn that into a weighing analysis at the end of like summary and final focus and just say, judge, you should vote for us because you should always prioritize the biggest impact over probability for XYZ reasons.
So here's some more concerns you should take into account before you read, or sometimes even before you answer framework. If you're straight, white, cis male, and you're reading oppression framework against minority debaters, it's kind of like just probably not something you should do because you don't want to, one, be like tokenizing an issue that isn't even specific to you, but you also don't want to put words into the mouths of people who might have like actually experienced the argument you're talking about or belong to communities who have also experienced oppression. Like here's an example: a man can argue that stopping sexual assault against women should be prioritized, but should not like tell a female survivor what they're going through. So you have to be careful about like recognizing like what your opponents have gone through, what like anybody in the room could have gone through, and being cognizant of that before you respond to especially structural violence frameworks, because it can also like it's very often like a delicate topic. And then you also like some responses to structural violence framework can be like pretty bad too. Like you'd never want to say they can't quantify their racism impact, so it doesn't matter. Like obviously the reason they ran framework is because it doesn't fall under like a util like cost benefit analysis framework, and there's a reason they're prioritizing it. And to just sort of like ignore that is, one, like not a very good debate strategy, but is two, like just not cognizant of what people have gone through and like the importance of that issue, because everything we talk about in debate round is a thing that affects real people. And so you just want to be like aware of that and take that into account in your responses in your arguments. Okay, so now we're gonna show some examples. I think I have one on. Can you all see if I go to Word?
Are you on Word right now?
Yeah.